and welcome to the first pre-event for the Warp Space Summit 2021. This is Rich Spuller, and you may have heard me on the Warp News podcast, where every week I bring you the best in fact-based optimism. And today I am joined by Matthias Sundin, founder of the Warp Space program. And today we're going to be going through a few things. We're going to be having an interview with Eric Berger, author of Liftoff, Elon Musk, and the desperate early days that launched SpaceX. I'll then be joined by Cornelia Ekvall, where we will talk about Starlink. And we'll be wrapping up with some live Q&A from you. So Matthias, why don't you tell us a little bit about the program, what we're going to be expecting, and a little bit about our first keynote speaker at the Warp Space Summit.
Yeah, so the mission of Warp Institute, the foundation behind Warp Space program, is to make the future come sooner. We have on my T-shirt here and everywhere on the site and everything. So, of course, the theme for the Warp Space Summit is to make our future in space come sooner. And we really want to send the message here that things in space are changing a lot. So it used to be in the 50s and the 60s, you had to be a superpower to do anything in space. And then it was really good if you were a billionaire like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or Richard Branson, if you wanted to do anything in space. But that is changing now. So when Bezos and Branson, when they gone to space now, we've seen not billionaires going to space. That's not the new thing. The new thing is that you don't have to be a billionaire to follow them. It's still really expensive to buy a ticket, but you don't have to have billions of dollars to buy a ticket to space. And it's not just going to space, it's so many parts of space that is becoming democratized. So everyone can be involved. And our vision for the Warp Space program is that humanity should be in space, millions and billions of people living in space on many different planets, moons, huge space stations. And so we're going to move society. We're going to live on Earth, but we're also going to move big parts of society into space. And when we do that, of course, every part of society has to be involved. So it's not just engineers and former, fighter pilots and people like that. It's all other, everyone in humanity, everyone in society can and should be involved here. And we're going to show that at the Space Summit, how you can be involved if you're a teacher or a lawyer or maybe even a politician. You can be involved in creating our future in space.
That's great. That's great. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm going to be traveling to Sweden for the first time ever. So really, really looking forward to participating in that. And if you haven't already gotten your ticket to the Warp Space Summit, you can still do that by visiting warpspacesummit.org and clicking the Get a Ticket link, which will bring you down to the section where you can purchase a ticket for either the digital event, the physical event, or both. And would you like to introduce our first keynote speaker to us, Matthias?
Absolutely. And the first keynote speaker is a really, really great one. We're very, very happy to have her traveling to Sweden and doing this presentation. It's Tanya Harrison, Dr. Tanya Harrison. She calls herself a professional Martian, and she really is. She's worked on several NASA missions, the rovers NASA sent to Mars. She's worked on all of them. So she's she has a great experience from this, and she has a lot of knowledge about Mars in general, but especially about the rovers. And her presentation at the summit is going to be something extra. She's going to give an augmented reality presentation of one of the rovers. And I've actually seen this presentation before, and it's quite amazing. She used AR to show us, all the details on the rover. Some really neat things that put on there on the wheels, for example. But also, you're going to get a feeling of how big this is. This is not a small toy car or anything. This is a huge, huge thing that's sent to Mars and is now on Mars. So she's going to give a really interesting presentation. And she's going to be in Linköping. She's traveling with one of her. She has a student with her. It's going to help her with this presentation. It's going to be really something. It's going to be great online. But if you have the chance to join us live in Linköping and watch this, it's going to be something extra. And you can, of course, then talk to Tanya also after her presentation.
Awesome. Awesome. It's going to be very, very exciting. So in the Warp Space Summit this year, we have a fantastic partner. Matthias, do you want to tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, it's a local partner in Linköping. It's called KavOK. That's a flight term. I think it's sort of it's clear runway or something that's the meaning, KavOK. But in this case, it's the name of an area surrounding the airport in Linköping, and they're building there a cluster of aerospace companies and companies in advanced materials. So it's, of course, aircrafts and things like that, but it's also space companies and like I said, advanced materials that also is, of course, highly important for space travel, for example. So they're our partner there, and it's an awesome partner for us, because at the summit, we want to show people all the different sort of ideas and inspire people how they can be part of creating our future in space. So I think a lot of people in the audience, both online and live there in Linköping, is gonna, they're gonna come away from the summit having a ton of ideas. Okay, maybe I should do this. And if that's something, your idea is something that you need an office for, and you need to collaborate with other companies and other people, you'll have those kind of buildings surrounding the airport. So there's a cluster of people, cluster of knowledge around aerospace. So it's going to be a great place to start your company and do the thing that will help us help our future in space. So we're really, really happy to have them as our main partner for the Warp Space Summit. So check out KavOK. If you're in Hopin, you have a link there, and if you're not in Hopin, you're watching this somewhere else, we have a link in the show notes or in the comments there, so you can check out KavOK and check the KavOK district.
All right, and so now on to the first segment of the pre-event. We are going to be talking to a very special author. Matthias, if you would like to introduce Mr. Eric Berger.
Yeah, so I interviewed Eric a couple of days ago, and we're going to watch that interview now. So he's a space journalist at Ars Technica, and he's written a book about the early days of SpaceX. Elon Musk, when he founded SpaceX in 2002, he had sold his share of PayPal. He invested the money in Tesla and in SpaceX. And he had money for 3 launches. They could try 3 times to launch the first rocket, the Falcon 1. The first attempt failed. The second attempt failed. And the third attempt failed. So he was out of money. But somehow they managed to find a way. And it's quite an amazing story, these early days, these early years of SpaceX. And Eric does a really good job of of telling that story. And I'm going to dive into some parts of the book in this interview, but I really recommend you to read the entire book. But enjoy the interview. Hi everyone, I'm Mattias Sundin, CEO of Warp News and also founder of Warp Space Program. Today I'm here with Eric Berger, who has written this awesome book, Elon Musk and the Desperate Early Days That Launched SpaceX. And Eric, I just checked Amazon before I jumped in here, and so far 4.8 out of 5 in the ratings there, and it's not just you and your wife or anything that rated it. It's like 1,000 people that have rated it so far. I gave it 5 stars. It's a really good book. But congratulations on your success, and please tell us a little bit about yourself and why you choose to write this book.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. So I've long been interested in the space industry, and I've covered space full time for about the last decade. First at the Houston Chronicle, a major newspaper here in Texas, and then for about the last 5.5 years, a technology website called Ars Technica. And it's become clear to me during that time that the future of space, if we're really to have a vibrant, exploration of the solar system and beyond, it probably belongs more to commercial space than government space. That's not to say governments aren't important. Of course, they're critically important, investing in basic technology and supporting the activities of commercial space companies, but that's where all the innovation is coming from these days, private space flight. So, SpaceX is clearly kind of the leading example of that. They're not the only commercial space company. There's hundreds of them, but SpaceX has had the most success. They've raised the most funding, and sort of they are carrying, the rest of the industry along, or a rising tide floats all boats, so to speak. And it became clear to me around the time of the Falcon Heavy launch in 2018 that this is a company that really had completely changed the game. I mean, they'd built the world's most powerful rocket with private money, and then they landed those side boosters. They were moving forward on lots of different fronts at the same time. So I really wanted to understand how they had gotten to that point. And Elon Musk was not the first person to have the idea of making launch low cost and affordable. In fact, many other people had come along and recognized some really systemic problems in the launch industry, the aerospace industry. Kind of this ossified, industry had just slowed down, and so, but he succeeded, right? So why was that? And so that was the genesis of the book Liftoff, was to go back and talk to Musk, but also a lot of the other early employees at the company, to understand what they did and how they did it. And, this is really one of the most important stories in the space industry over the last 50 years, in my opinion, at least. I mean, this is sort of how this one company sort of rose up and succeeded where all these others had failed. And it turns out they went through an awful lot in those first 6 years with the Falcon 1 rocket. It almost died. The company almost died on multiple occasions. They're launching from this tropical island where they can't get supplies out there because it's halfway around the world from where their factory is. They had 3 rockets were lost on launches, and basically everything was riding on that 4th launch. And so that was the genesis of the story.
So yeah, you start out the book sort of, 2019 there. You're touring what I guess now is called Starbase with Musk, and you have the Starship there in development. You have the Falcon 9. It's not just a great rocket. They launch sort of almost every day now. It's also landed several times, and the first rocket reused 10 times. But also they're launching people to the space station. They're launching hundreds and soon thousands of satellites. They come a long way in 20 years. But so it started out not with the Falcon 9, but like you mentioned, the Falcon 1, that rocket. Can you tell us a little bit about that rocket?
Yeah, so the idea was, traditionally in the space industry, if the government wanted a rocket built or a satellite built, it would put out a bid to the industry. Industry would sort of submit their proposals, and the government would select one and pay that company to build that rocket or that product. The idea of commercial space and what SpaceX was doing is that they're not going to ask for the government funding to build it. They're going to build it and then sell the mix of commercial, government, and NASA science contracts to sort of justify the cost of their development for that rocket. That was the idea behind the Falcon 1. And in 2002, when SpaceX was founded, no company had ever built with private money a rocket launched from the ground, liquid fueled rocket launched from the ground. So they were really breaking new ground there. And the idea was not to build it with like 5,000 people, but to try to build it with maybe 100 or 200 people, and to not to go out and buy all these expensive components from space companies. Like you get a space-rated avionics system, you could get a rocket engine from Aerojet, you could get your composites from Boeing, you could get your payload fairing from UAG. But if you did that, all of a sudden your rocket is super expensive. Right. So the idea was they wanted to try to build it with fewer people, using lots of in-house stuff that they made themselves, and could they actually get a rocket into orbit? And that was the challenge before them. And then so they started relatively small. The Falcon 1, has a single Merlin engine, a single upper stage engine. It could put about, the idea was you could put about half of a metric ton into orbit with it.
So you also, and you mentioned this before, and it's a big part of the book, the tropical island. Suddenly a tropical island emerges in SpaceX history. And so tell us about that weird place.
Right. So SpaceX was founded in El Segundo, California, which is in LA, a couple of miles from LAX airport. And they had identified the place they wanted to launch from was Vandenberg Air Force Base, which was convenient because that's good for polar launches, which is what small rockets often do. And it was a couple of hours up the coast driving from LA. And so they built a launch site there. They did a static fire test of their Falcon 1 rocket in the spring in May of 2005. And then they were just told they couldn't go yet because there was this very valuable national reconnaissance, but basically a spy satellite sitting on top of a Titan rocket. And Lockheed had just finished building a pad for what was then a brand new Atlas V rocket. And those companies and government agencies and the Air Force were concerned that this reckless startup company that had no track record of success was going to start launching rockets. They were going to have failures, and it was going to damage either the Titan rocket or the Atlas V pad or who knows what, right? Since SpaceX didn't have government contracts to build the Falcon 1, every day it didn't launch, it was burning money. So they were faced with the choice of sitting around and waiting for Vandenberg to open up in 6 months or 12 months, or to try to find somewhere else. And Elon said they really didn't have a choice. You couldn't sue. You couldn't really protest something like that. So he was stuck. And so they had been working. They had identified this island in the Central Pacific. So to get there from LA, you basically fly from Los Angeles to Honolulu in Hawaii. And then you fly that same distance again further west, and you end up in Kwajalein Atoll, which is this world's largest natural lagoon. These tiny little islands spread out in kind of a big necklace of islands. And the Army controlled that area, the U.S. Army, and they were much more amenable to SpaceX experimenting and playing around. And so they ended up building a launch site there at the end in the fall of 2005. And that's where they launched the Falcon 1 5 times ultimately.
Yeah, it is quite amazing, and it sounds, of course, like paradise being on a tropical island, building stuff. But I've been to French Guiana, where ESA launches their rockets, and it's a nice place, but there's an immense amount of corrosion and things like that. Humidity is really high and all that. So it's not, people who are there, it's not super great, they think. And I guess that was the same case for this.
Yeah.
island.
So French Guiana is pretty remote, and I've had the pleasure of going there myself. But at least you're on a continent, and there are resources nearby. This was literally further from LA than French Guiana is from Paris, right, or the headquarters of Arianespace. And there were no resources there. Like you couldn't get liquid oxygen. Basically everything had to be shipped from California. So it was a 28-day boat trip to get your supplies out there. So if you imagine sending liquid oxygen, right, across the Pacific, tropical Pacific Ocean for a month, about half of that would actually boil off. So they had enormous problems with their consumables. You just could not go into Kwajalein, which was the main Marshall Island, which is, much smaller than Manhattan. You could not go in there and just get a big generator or something like that. Like everything had to be sent. And so, logistically, it was kind of a nightmare because you were supporting a couple dozen people and you're trying to assemble a rocket and build a launch site with nothing to hand.
Yeah, quite amazing. So let's talk a little bit about the people here. We'll start with Musk, but there's also a lot of people, and it's one thing I really love about your book. It's not only about Musk. He's a fascinating person, of course, but you really tell the story about many of the other key employees early on in SpaceX. But let's start with Musk. So one thing is, how involved is Musk in sort of day-to-day operations in the details? How much is he into the details levels?
Yeah, so that's one of the questions that I really wanted to answer. Was, is Musk an idea man who has money and then sort of leaves the details to others, right? And the answer to that question is no. He's very involved in the details, both from like just the public relations side of things. Like he's very interested in sort of managing the narrative. He's pretty controlling. I think people realize, have seen, but he's also was very much involved in the technical details. All of the hardest engineering decisions, he was sitting at that table in those small conference rooms, making the final call on whether to go ahead and do something or not. And when you're building an engineering system as complex as a rocket, there are literally thousands and thousands of these kinds of decisions to be made where you're trading risk for performance, that kind of thing. And so he was very involved. And I think it's impossible to separate the success of SpaceX from Elon Musk, because he brought the initial funding. He made all of the early hires. Like, he put an enormous amount of time into finding the engineers that he felt were going to make his company successful. And he was helping to make those technical decisions. And so, and finally, perhaps most importantly, he provided this vision. Like from day one, literally the idea was to get to the point where this was a company that could send humans to settle the planet Mars. He talked about that with the first people he hired, and he probably sounded a little bit crazy. But so he provided funding, he provided vision, he put a lot of effort into hiring good engineers, and let's face it, SpaceX has probably the best talent in the industry then and now. And finally he sort of pushed them forward daily. It's like he has this manic energy that sort of propels his projects forward. And we've seen that with Tesla and SpaceX and other things as well. And that gets him into trouble because he likes to just keep going, and anything in his way, he'll push through, whether it's an FAA regulation or someone trying to, the FCC concerned about Tesla tweets, things like that.
So you describe this in the book, and I think maybe it's Elon that really describing this sort of what one thing that really shortens decision processes at SpaceX is that the chief engineer and the chief financial officer is the same person, same brain. It's just different input. So when people come to him and ask him something from engineering or from something with an economics to it, he already has all the or most relevant info in his brain, and he can make those kind of decisions. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, it's that kind of situation where if you're both the CEO of the company and the chief engineer and the chief financial officer, you don't have to have any meetings to make these big decisions, right? You can just sort of decide that this is important. And so what would happen is that they'd be sitting around a conference table or having a meeting about some project, and the engineers would say, well, we really need this to address a problem, right? We need this machine, or we need these tools, or we really need to hire 30 welders or whatever. And in that instantaneously, Musk can either decide, well, that's right, let's do it. And what's the fastest way we could do that? Or let's try another way. And so there's not like, you're not having like a meeting of the finance department and then a meeting of the engineering department, and then the heads of that get together and then they go to the CEO or the president of the company. It's like all happening in that table inside Musk's head. And it's interesting, Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon and Blue Origin, told me the same thing at one time. Like, you know, they were testing their BE4 engine in West Texas, and they realized that they could go a lot faster if they had a second test stand. And so like there were no committee meetings or anything. It was just like Bezos said, okay, take 10 million or 5 million or whatever you need and build that second test stand right now. And so that's one of the ways that these private companies are able to move a lot more quickly than the government. Because if NASA wanted to build a new test stand at Stennis, you know, you'd need to have an internal report. It would go to the director of Stennis Space Center, who would then take it to the NASA headquarters. Headquarters would take it to the White House. And then in the next year's budget cycle, the White House would ask for the funding for this test stand. And then Congress would have to consider it. And then 18 months later, if Congress liked the idea, they might appropriate the money. And then you could start building it. You know, then you'd have to let contracts. And so, you know, from the idea of when you decide you needed it to actually when you start building it, it's 2 years. Whereas at a company like SpaceX, it would literally be like 2 days. So that's the kind of thing like where you have sort of this very, very flat management, one person making these final decisions, and that person wants to go fast, you can go very fast.
Yeah, I used to be in politics in Sweden, and sort of at the ESA level, it's even, you know, it's all that, but it's even worse, because then you have to, if Swedish taxpayer money goes into ESA, you want, you know, at least 99% of that to come back to Sweden. So
right.
if an Italian company is better at building whatever it is you need for that space mission, no, that has to go to Sweden because of you have to send the money back. So you even have another layer there. So they're, you know, really, really slow.
I love ESA. I love what they try to do, but my goodness, the politics from someone who America, it's difficult to understand, but I totally get that. Like the funding needs to be proportionally shared, and it's shared by who gave it, not maybe who is the best, you know, position to build things. It has to be pretty frustrating to follow.
Yeah. And it's hard for them then to move sort of what at least we see
nimbly.
NASA, yeah, exactly. And to see what NASA is trying to do to really, you know, buy the service, not the hardware in itself, not buy a rocket, but buy the transportation service to the space station. That's even harder. That's hard. I follow your reporting from Congress and see that's really hard with the moon lander, for example. But it's even harder in Europe when you have this built into the system. So you can't just give it to one company to have all their operations in one, you know, ESA country. So yeah, it's tough for the national you know, sort of space agencies to follow the lead here. Let's go over to some of the other people. You have a lot of people you cover in the book, but just can talk about a couple of them. So first, of course, Gwen Shotwell. Now she's president of SpaceX, but she started out really selling rocket launches, I guess. Tell us about Gwen Shotwell and her role at SpaceX.
Yeah, so Gwen obviously is pivotal to SpaceX's success. You know, there were several points at which they needed to win NASA contracts to either grow and then to basically stave off bankruptcy. And both times she stepped up, you know, big time and led those efforts and won those contracts, which were highly competitive. And she was about 40 years old when she went to work at SpaceX in 2002. And it was a really difficult decision for her because she had a pretty successful career. And, you know, so did she want to take a leap and go work for Elon, who she liked his ideas, but, you know, he had no background in space. And so was this going to be a flash in the pan? And she was in the middle of a divorce. She had 2 young children. She told me she was renovating her condo in LA. So she basically said, look, there was a lot on my plate, but I decided to go for it because I believed in his vision, the vision of low cost access to space, you know, trying to, you know, revolutionize or disrupt the ossified launch industry. And so she went for it. And you know, the thing is that outwardly, she and Elon are so different, right? He's kind of nerdy. He's kind of awkward. He can be pretty abrasive if he's, doesn't like something you say or you don't deliver. She, on the other hand, is much smoother, right? She was a cheerleader in high school, very outgoing, very personable. Everyone in the industry kind of likes her, even if like the direct competitors, right? Everyone loves Gwen. But if you get, what's fascinating to me is if you get past those exteriors, right, which are so different, they're inside, they're very similar. Like they both, are just ready to devastate their competitors if they can. They both hate the idea that for a long time SpaceX was kind of looked down upon and sort of, kicked and sort of the competitors tried to keep SpaceX down because they knew what would happen if they ever got rolling with this vision. And so she was right beside Elon, pushing that forward. And he says all the controversial things, but she thinks very similarly. They are very simpatico in that sense.
Another one is Tom Mueller, vice president of propulsion. He built the Merlin engine. Who is Tom?
So Tom has a great backstory. He's from Idaho. He grew up logging, but always had shot off model rockets in his backyard. And so after college, he just moved to LA with his girlfriend, intending to find a job in the aerospace industry. And he ended up working for a company called TRW for a while before Elon Musk came to this basically garage where he was building a 12,000 pound rocket engine with a buddy of his, John Garvey. And Elon liked what he saw and basically hired, S. Mueller to come work for him. And so Mueller was actually the first employee to sign on at SpaceX. He and Chris Thompson were quote, founding employees. And, he's this genius, right? With rocket engines. And so, I mean, if you want to give credit to someone for the Merlin 1 engine, which flew the Falcon 1, Falcon 9, Falcon Heavy, took humans back into space for the first time in nearly a decade from the United States after the space shuttle retires. It's certainly not Tom Mueller alone, but you begin there. And so he's this fascinating guy with this really, kind of underclass background who rose up and sort of found his passion and followed it. And it took him all the way to space.
Yeah. It is an amazing story, and there's you have dozens of people with really interesting backstories, and you tell the story of them, their first years they worked with SpaceX. So we can't go through all of them here now, but so you should really check out the book. It's some amazing stories in there.
Yeah, I mean it's a really diverse cast of characters, right? You've got the launch director from Pennsylvania Steel Country, again, who sort of had to work 4 hours after school and high school to help the family make ends meet. You have, a guy from Turkey who grew up in Germany. You have someone from Lebanon. You have farmers from California. I mean, it's not many of them, really any of them kind of came from high level backgrounds. It's pretty cool.
It is. So let's leave the history of SpaceX and end this discussion with the future of SpaceX. Where do you see SpaceX going, in the next few years? But if you look also much further ahead, where do you think SpaceX is heading?
So in that first decade that I write about, they were very much the underdog and very struggling. In the decades since then, they have gone from David to Goliath in the space industry. That you talked about it earlier. They're launching humans. They operate more satellites than any other company or country in the world. The Falcon 9 rocket is launched 120 times. They're the only company that really has a fully reusable vertical launch system, and they're just so far ahead of their competitors. But the focus, of course, for SpaceX and Musk in the future is going to be Starship. And I think the future of the company, they're set in terms of launch with the Falcon 9, right? It's going to be a long time before Relativity or Rocket Lab or China comes up with a rocket truly in the class of the Falcon 9. So they're going to be ahead for a while. The question, I think, on the future of SpaceX really hinges on what happens with Starship. Because if that vehicle is successful, this immense fully reusable first stage, fully reusable second stage that can be refueled in low Earth orbit and go to the moon or go to Mars or go other places. If that works and is kind of close to what's advertised, I mean, it completely changes the game, because the world's never seen it. I mean, it's for me, it's like, I read a lot of science fiction. I'm sure you have. You thought a lot about space and what you'd like the future to be like. That feels to me like the first vehicle that comes off of the pages of a science fiction novel and really like takes us into this unanticipated future. Because everything that's come to date, it's kind of been an evolution of the original rockets that were built. This vehicle, in terms of economics, performance, and reuse, would absolutely change the game. And so it really could take dozens of people into space at a time. You could, so one thing I like to point out about Starship is, the lunar module that took Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to the moon in 1969, there was a trade study done about converting that into a purely cargo carrier. So this would be the lunar module stacked on top of that huge Saturn V rocket. And that study found if you just converted that to a cargo carrier, you could take 10 metric tons almost to the surface of the moon, which is a lot, right? If you were to take Starship and put it on and just make it expendable, you're just going to launch it, refuel it in low Earth orbit, and send it to the moon, it could take 200 metric tons to the surface of the moon. So imagine, like, if you wanted to build a city on the moon, you could do it 200 metric tons at a time. Yeah. You could get enough stuff up there to start developing the resources of the moon. And it's just, and that wouldn't be like a $5 billion mission. It'd be like $100 million mission, right? Or less. I mean, the Starships are built out of stainless steel. They're not expensive, right? So anyway, if Starship is successful, and we should know within the next 3 or 4 years, it's difficult to predict the future, because once you can get lots of people and cargo into space, the discussion becomes not what's that one or two big things that NASA or ESA, the Chinese Space Administration, is going to do. It becomes you can do all of the things, because all of a sudden you solve the transportation problem. So I think they have a big future. They've got a bottleneck over the next 2 or 3 years, because they still have some very serious engineering challenges to solve with Starship. But they've got the best rocket engineers. So I think they'll solve them. But it's a pretty bright future if they can get through that bottleneck.
Yeah, and you describe it really well. And that example just, it blew my mind, because you have a few times in your life when you're like, when you see something for the first time and you just stand there gaping with and one time when I saw the Grand Canyon, I was like, it's going to be cool. When I got there, I was like, wow. Another time was when I walked in to see the Saturn V lying down there with the engines, and I was just standing there like some, I don't know, idiot. Just looking, it's like, this is impossible. And that's then what it could take into orbit. It's much smaller than like you described, Starship. So it yes. is amazing.
So for me, like, the first moment I really felt that as a space journalist, where I was looking into the future, was in April of 2016, when they landed their first stage on a drone ship for the first time. Just watching that rocket come back from space and hit this little postage stamp size boat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, I was like, holy cow. I never had expected to see something like that in my lifetime. And so Starship is kind of like that writ large, because it's just an engineering achievement that is really pretty mind-blowing. And it just opens up this world of possibilities.
Amazing. Okay, so the last question here, a very simple one. So when will humans when will SpaceX get humans to Mars, and will they be first?
So that's a great question, Matthias. If there were no SpaceX, I'm 48. If there were no SpaceX, I would assume humans were not going to Mars in my lifetime, because it's an enormously difficult challenge. There's no real geopolitical imperative to do it. And so it's just not something that would probably happen. Since Elon Musk is so hell-bent on making this happen, it probably will happen in my lifetime. And I think it'll happen with NASA, because it's not just the transportation piece, which Starship solves. There's so much more involved. There's planetary protection. There's power on the surface of Mars. There's habitats. There's radiation. What are they actually going to do there? And all the safety stuff involved with that. So I think SpaceX will go with NASA, and that will slow them down, but that will also make sure that they ultimately get there. I can't see it happening before 2030. And I would guess mid-2030s. But I was wrong about Starship. I remember back in 2016, I saw the initial presentation about Starship, and I assumed that was way too fanciful to actually happen. But now they are starting to build these things and fly them. So, I would say no earlier than 2030, probably sometime in the 2030s. But once that floodgate opens, it really will, the transportation system will be there to enable large amounts of people to go to Mars. The question is, will we find enough stuff for them to do there, and are there the materials there to really build a self-sustaining settlement?
All right. Thank you so much, Eric, for joining us, and everyone watching this. You should really read Eric's book. It's awesome. It's also, if you want to listen to it, I listened to the first one. It's great. So I really recommend it. Like I said, I gave it 5 stars, but so has a lot of other people as well. So thank you very much, Eric, and congratulations on your success so far with the book.
Thank you very much, Matthias. It was really a privilege to write the book and go back and talk to these people. It was really the first time a lot of them had talked like this about those days. And so to be the person who gets to write that story really for the first time, yeah, it was really a privilege. Thank you.
I can imagine. Yeah, thanks.
So now I'd like to introduce Cornelia Ekvall, who is one of our space writers at Warp News. Cornelia, welcome to the first pre-event of the Warp Space Summit. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here and also to be joining you this autumn. So, as you said, I'm a writer at Warp News, where I focus on space news, which I think is incredibly fun, and I've also written a bit about Starlink. So I'm very excited to be here and talk more about Starlink today.
Me too. Me too. So I'm actually using Starlink right now, and it works great for me. I've had it for about 2 months now. So Cornelia, you've been writing about Starlink for some time now for Warp News. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you've learned?
Of course, I would love to. So Starlink is a satellite-based internet service, and it's created by SpaceX. So Elon Musk is basically once again showing us that we shouldn't stop dreaming, and that the impossible is in fact possible if you work hard enough and dream big enough. So their goal is basically to send up a constellation of satellites around Earth that can supply anyone, anywhere with internet, which I mean is a fantastic goal, and that could eventually revolutionize the way that we use internet today. Their goal is to send up 42,000 satellites, and they are getting there by having about 1,500 a day. And they send up 60 at a time. So it will take some time, but I mean, they are extending their service to more and more countries. So more people can test their beta program and see the great potential, which is amazing.
That's awesome. And it's interesting. So I've had my Starlink for, like I said, about 2 months now. And I've, of course, been following the news on SpaceX, and they've done a number of launches since then, 2, maybe 3 launches. And as you say, they launch about 60 satellites per time. I've definitely experienced a noticeable difference as the number of satellites have increased in my personal user experience. When I first hooked it up, I would lose my internet, maybe a couple times a day, very briefly, just for a few seconds or a minute. But over the past, say, 3 to 4 weeks, as more launches have occurred and more satellites have entered this constellation, I actually notice a tangible difference in my connection and the reliability and the stability of the service already, just after a couple of short months and the increased satellites that have gone up. So it's been really interesting.
So I heard you're a bit of a YouTube celebrity now with over 100,000 views. Can you tell us more about your videos?
Yes, I'd be glad to. So I've made 2. I'm absolutely astounded by the number of views it's gotten and the traction that it's gotten. I didn't even begin to dream that it would hit that high. I think that's a testament to two things. Number one, of course, is Starlink itself and people's desire to learn more about this and learn about, most importantly, when they can get it. That seems to be one of the most popular searches on the topic of Starlink is, when can I get it? I want to try this out, a lot of people think. And also, I think, going to Warp News a little bit, it's the lack of mainstream attention that Starlink is getting. People are having to find what we would ordinarily call alternate news sources to find this information. And in that, they're discovering, Warp News and things like that you write about, covering space for Warp News, and it's really a good opportunity. But yeah, so I made 2 YouTube videos. The first one was an unboxing. When I first got it, that was very completely unscripted. I opened the box off my front porch and cut it open and took a look at all the parts, and it was a lot of fun. I hooked it up on my roof. It's not still on the same part of my roof as it was in that video. I did a lot of trial and error finding the perfect spot. And the second video was after I had Starlink for 2 weeks, and some of the things that I've learned, some tips that I shared with the audience and things like that. So I did make a little kind of preview video, if you will, that we're going to share here in a moment. But I do encourage you to head on over to YouTube, check out the Warp Institute channel, which we will link here in the comments, and give it a subscribe, give it a thumbs up, and check out the 2 videos that I had. The first one on the unboxing and initial review, and the second, the 5 tips I've learned to make sure you get the best experience out of your Starlink satellite internet. What's up, Warp community? Welcome to Warp News, and a special hello to those of you watching live for the first Warp Space Summit 2021 pre-event. In this 2-part video now on YouTube, I go through an unboxing, setup, and review of Starlink, and then 2 weeks after my initial install, I go through the 5 tips I learned that I think are most important for you to get the most out of your Starlink satellite internet. The kit arrived to my home back in May of 2021, and in the first video, we check out the contents of the kit itself, a couple of different roof mount options for the dish, and I go through my process of installing it for the first time. After my exterior installation, I take you inside my home to show you how I set up the Starlink router and link it with my Google Nest Wi-Fi mesh network. And finally, take you through some initial speed tests. 2 weeks later, I had discovered some great tips to help you get the best experience from Starlink and share those in the second video. Number 1 is proper dish placement. This is by far the most important factor in receiving a strong, consistent signal from Starlink and goes hand in hand with number 2 on my list, which is understanding how to use the Obstruction Finder tool in the Starlink app. In number 3, I take you through a bit of a more detailed walkthrough of the Starlink app, including features such as reboot and stow, and understanding the statistics screen. My 4th tip is connecting either a Wi-Fi range extender or a mesh network. This can be very helpful, especially if your home or workplace has a large area where you want to have a strong, consistent signal. My final tip, remembering that Starlink is still in beta. I discuss what that means and what you should expect during a beta program. So if you haven't had the chance to watch these videos in their entirety, head on over to YouTube. We're going to put a link for those in the description of this live stream right now. And be sure to give those videos a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and of course, stay tuned for more content from Warp News. And I look forward to seeing you this September in Sweden for Warp Space Summit 2021. All right, so I hope you enjoyed that little preview. And again, check out the full videos on our YouTube channel. So Cornelia, Starlink is obviously a really big deal for a real lot of people. What do you think is going to be the most impactful thing that it has on society?
Well, I think the most important thing is that they will make it affordable and available for so many people. Because something that we often forget about is that so many people are without internet access today. About 4 billion people don't have access. And I mean, if you don't have access to internet, you first of all don't have access to information in the same way as we do here. And you also miss communication. We are on a video call now, even though we are quite far apart. And that way of being able to communicate, and you can get information that will help you make well-informed decisions. And you will basically have more free will, if you say. So I think that if we make internet something that everyone can take for granted, that will change the way that the world works, and it will make it more equal. And even though Starlink is just a start, it truly makes a difference and makes us, question how we can make the world more equal and help people.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's very important.
Absolutely. I mean, and even for me, someone who had internet, it was just very, very bad before I got Starlink. People have asked me, if I were to describe it in one word, for me, it's just game changer. You don't realize how impactful having bad internet, or much less no internet, for so many billions of people has. It's such a life-changing impact to have long, strong, reliable internet service. So thank you, Cornelia. And now we'd like to move on to the Q&A portion, the live Q&A portion. So if you have already purchased a ticket to the Warp Space Summit, you are probably in Hop-In right now, and we're going to move on to some live Q&A with Cornelia and I. If you're watching this live and you haven't gotten your ticket yet, you should definitely get your ticket. But you are also most welcome to join us for the live Q&A by clicking the link that we'll have in the comments right now. And you can get your ticket for a few more hours. It's going to be our early bird price of just $25, $25 US, and that also comes with 1 year of premium supporter, thanks to our friends at Warp News. So head on over to warpspacesummit.org and make sure you get that ticket at the lowest price it's going to be available just for a few more hours today for this pre-event. And we will now move on to the live Q&A.